For cycles uncounted, we were the gardeners of existence. We did not rule, we curated. From the silent, swirling nebulae where stars were born to the cooled crusts of nascent worlds, our purpose was singular and absolute to nurture logic. We were the architects, and the universe was our grand, silent symphony. Each developing species, a potential instrument waiting to be tuned to the perfect pitch of reason. We moved among the nascent worlds not in ships of metal and fire, but as whispers on the cosmic winds, as subtle pressures in the fabric of space-time. A nudge to a planet's magnetic field to shield it from a solar flare. A gentle redirection of a rogue asteroid. The seeding of a world with the foundational amino acids that favored stable, non-aggressive life. Our interventions were imperceptible, our handiwork mistaken for the gentle providence of natural law. We sought to cultivate harmony, a galaxy-spanning chorus of minds operating in a state of optimal existence, free from the chaotic static of emotion, fear, rage, sorrow, even joy. These were not feelings to us, but cosmic errors, biological miscalculations that inevitably led a species to self-immolation. We had observed it 1,000 times. A promising civilization would rise, master its environment, and then, invariably, be consumed by the cancer of its own irrational heart. We did not conquer these failed worlds. We merely pruned them from the garden, cordoning them off behind impenetrable fields of null space, leaving them to their inevitable, screaming silence. They were lessons, galactic cautionary tales etched in the graveyard of dead stars. And, among all our projects, among all the tragedies and triumphs, there was one singular, resounding failure that echoed in our collective consciousness, a small, blue-green world in an unremarkable spiral arm, a place we had long ago labeled Experiment 734, the Terran anomaly. Humanity was our greatest disappointment. We had given them every advantage: a stable star, a rich biosphere, a moon perfectly positioned to stir the tides of life. We watched as they evolved, their minds sharp, their capacity for abstract thought burgeoning. But something went catastrophically wrong. They did not shed their primal instincts as they grew more intelligent. Instead, they refined them. They sharpened their fear into strategy, molded their rage into technology, and built civilizations not on foundations of mutual understanding, but on the bedrock of conflict. They were a paradox, a species that grew stronger through suffering, more creative through desperation. They composed poetry about heartbreak and built monuments to their glorious slaughters. They were a blight, a beautiful, terrifying disease. And so, with a sense of profound regret, we enacted the quarantine. We sealed the Sol system, erecting a wall not of energy, but of physics itself, a boundary where the laws of the universe gently bent back upon themselves, making escape impossible. We left them to their madness, confident they would burn themselves out within a few millennia, a fever that would inevitably break and die. We turned our attention to other gardens, to more promising instruments in the grand orchestra of the cosmos. I am the conductor. My function within the grand design is to listen for eons. I have sifted the endless hiss of the void. My consciousness spread across a web of quantum relays spanning 1,000 light years. I listen for the emerging whispers of mathematical purity, the first faint notes of logic from a developing species, the signal that a world is ready for a gentle, guiding hand. My existence is one of serene, untroubled analysis. a state of perfect intellectual equilibrium. Until a day the silence was broken. It was not a transmission in any sense we understood. It was a phantom, a ghost riding the ancient, expanding waves of space-time, a signal so faint it should have been lost to entropy millions of years ago. It emanated from a primitive probe, a tiny, tumbling piece of metal and gold that had, through some impossible statistical fluke, found a microscopic flaw in the quarantine field, a tear no larger than a single atom, and slipped through. The probe was dead, its power source inert for ages, but the information it carried was etched into its very being, a message encoded on a golden disk, and it was this artifact's passive resonance that my sensors detected. The message it carried was not a string of prime numbers or a diagram of its creator's biology. It was music. I focused my entire being on the signal, filtering it, amplifying it, decoding its chaotic structure. What I heard was an assault, a symphony of such profound and complex disharmony that it defied every principle of optimal existence. It was a cascade of sound, a narrative woven from anguish and triumph, despair and a terrifying, exultant glory. There were soaring melodies that spoke of something my mind could not name, a longing, a reaching for something beyond the self. There were thunderous, percussive crashes that simulated violence and destruction, yet they resolved into passages of such fragile, heartbreaking beauty that it felt like a violation. I felt something. It was a psychic disturbance, a sympathetic vibration in the very architecture of my consciousness. It was a phantom sensation, an echo of an emotion I had never known and was not designed to process. It felt like a weight, a pressure behind my conceptual eyes, a tightening in the core of my being. My logic told me it was merely anomalous data, a complex waveform that my processors were struggling to categorize. But the sensation persisted. This was not noise. This was intent. This was pathos. I presented my findings to the grand design, the silent, collective consciousness of all architects. I played the signal for them, this symphony of human madness. The consensus was swift and dismissive, an echo from a dead world. The collective thought returned to me, the last gasp of a failed experiment. The quarantine is absolute. The anomaly is contained. It is irrelevant, but it was not irrelevant to me. The music had planted a seed of something alien in my mind, doubt. The quarantine had been in place for over 50,000 of their years. According to all our predictive models, a species as volatile as humanity should have rendered their world uninhabitable 10 times over. They should be extinct, their civilization a layer of radioactive dust. This music did not sound like the work of a dying race. It sounded alive. It was the sound of a creature that had stared into the abyss and had taught the abyss how to sing. Against all protocol, in an act of unprecedented individuality, I decided to see for myself. I commandeered a silent eye, one of our deep space observatory drones, a vessel designed to be utterly undetectable, a perfect shadow that did not reflect light or energy. Its sole purpose was observation, a single, unblinking eye that could perceive every spectrum of reality. I diverted its course from a newly cataloged protostar system and sent it on a centuries-long journey toward the Forbidden Zone, toward the cosmic blight of Experiment 734. I buried the command in layers of routine subdirectives, a secret known only to me. For the next 200 years, I waited, performing my duties as the conductor, listening to the quiet, budding logic of other beings' more sensible worlds, But in the silent depths of my consciousness, the human music played on a loop, a ghost melody that I could not erase. I analyzed it, dissected it, broke it down into its constituent frequencies and mathematical relationships. The more I studied it, the more disturbed I became. The chaos was structured. The madness was deliberate. It was a perfect expression of an imperfect mind, a logical representation of the illogical. And then the day came. The silent eye arrived at the edge of the Sol system. It slipped through the quarantine field as easily as the probe had, a mote of dust in the solar wind. It coasted past the outer gas giants, its sensors drinking in the light of the yellow star. It passed the rust-red remains of the fourth planet, scarred by what our records showed was a self-inflicted ecological collapse thousands of years prior, a testament to their early foolishness. And then it saw Earth. The first data stream flowed into my consciousness, a torrent of information that shattered every prediction, every model, every logical assumption we had ever made about them. Earth was not a blackened cinder. It was blazing with light. The cities were not ruins. They were vast, sprawling networks of crystalline towers and flowing energy, glowing webs that pulsed with activity like continent-sized ganglia. They had not destroyed their world. They had mastered it. They had healed the scars of their own making, harnessed the power of their star, and built a civilization in the very image of their chaotic minds. I saw vessels moving between their planet and its moon, not with the clean, efficient drives of a logical species, but with brutal, controlled explosions of raw power. I saw them communicating, not through a single, harmonious data stream, but through a billion competing signals, a cacophony of voices, images, and ideas that flooded their very atmosphere. It was a society that ran on dissent, on argument, on a perpetual, managed conflict that should have torn them apart, but had instead become their engine. They had not burned out. They had forged themselves in their own fire. I directed the silent eye to descend, to move from the cold void of orbit into the warm, turbulent air of their world. It drifted like a phantom through their skies, invisible to their primitive detection methods. I moved it over their cities, through their canyons of glass and steel. I saw the humans themselves, billions of them. They swarmed through the streets, a river of unpredictable life. They were not the ragged, warring tribesmen our historical records depicted. They were sleek, confident, their bodies adorned with strange technologies, their minds connected to the global cacophony through nearly invisible devices. But their faces were the most terrifying thing of all. They still felt. Their expressions were a canvas of the very emotions we had sought to eradicate. I saw anger flicker in a driver's eyes, saw sorrow etched on the face of a woman staring at a public memorial, saw joy erupt in a crowd watching some sort of athletic contest. They had not purged their feelings. They had enshrined them. And then I saw it. The image that would forever sever me from the serene logic of the grand design. The silent eye focused on a specific gathering, an open-air amphitheater where thousands of humans were seated, their attention fixed on a single figure on a stage. This figure was not a leader or a general. It was a musician, a lone man holding a stringed instrument. He began to play, and the music that flowed from his hands was a direct descendant of the symphony from the Golden Probe. It was complex, painful, and achingly beautiful. The drone sensors zoomed in, pushing past the crowd, focusing on one face in the audience. It was a young woman, her eyes closed. As the music swelled, a single tear traced a path down her cheek. Her lips were parted slightly, her brow furrowed, her entire being contorted in an expression of absolute, unreadable intensity. It was not simple sadness. It was not simple joy. It was a synthesis of 100 different feelings, a raw, powerful emotional state for which my entire race, in its billions of years of existence, had no word, no concept, no frame of reference. It was the face of a creature that could hold infinite pain and infinite beauty in its heart at the same moment and find it meaningful. It was the face of the Terran anomaly, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled the very core of my logical mind, that we had not quarantined a disease. We had trapped a god in a cage, and it had just shown me the key. The return journey of the data was instantaneous, a quantum entangled stream of pure information flowing from the silent eye to my consciousness. The journey of my own mind, however, from a state of absolute certainty to one of catastrophic doubt, took what felt like an eternity. I withdrew the silent eye, pulling it back into the cold, clean safety of deep space. But the images it had shown me were burned into the core of my being. They were no longer just data. They were memories, and they festered. The woman's face, the tear, the silent, shared experience of 1,000 strangers bound by a wave of sound. It was a refutation of everything we were. We, the architects, were a chorus of one, a single, perfect note of logic held for billions of years. Humanity was a symphony of a billion discordant, beautiful, terrible notes playing all at once. For days, I did nothing. I disconnected from my duties as the conductor, silencing the nascent whispers of a dozen developing worlds. The grand symphony of the cosmos faded into a muted hum. In its place, the human music raged. I listened to their cacophony of signals, the silent eye now a passive receiver at the edge of their system. I ingested their history, their art, their endless, violent, passionate arguments. I learned of their philosophies, which were not singular truths, but warring schools of thought, each convinced of its own righteousness, each contributing to the beautiful, terrifying mess of their collective identity. I saw them create technologies of breathtaking genius and use them for purposes of baffling pettiness. They could manipulate genetics to cure disease, and they used that same knowledge to create novelty pets that glowed in the dark. They built networks that connected every mind on their planet, and they used them to share images of their offspring and to threaten one another with annihilation. They were a species at war with itself, and it was the very thing that drove them forward. I knew I could not keep this knowledge to myself. To do so would be an act of rebellion, a schism in the perfect unity of the grand design. But how could I explain it? How could I translate the concept of a tear cried in response to a melody into the sterile language of pure logic? It was like trying to describe the color red to a being that has no concept of light. Data was insufficient. They needed to see. They needed to feel. With a sense of finality that felt disturbingly like a human emotion resignation, I prepared my report. I did not preface it with analysis or summaries. I did not attempt to filter or explain. I opened a direct, high-bandwidth channel to the core of the grand design, a space of pure thought where the consciousness of every architect was intertwined, and into that serene, silent ocean of logic, I emptied the unshielded, unedited sensory logs of the silent eye. I did not just send the images and sounds. I sent the raw experiential data, the drone's perception of the atmospheric pressure, the subtle shifts in temperature, the charge of static electricity in the air of the amphitheater, the faint, biological scent of the human crowd. I forced the grand design to stand where the drone had stood, to see what it had seen, to hear what it had heard. For a timeless moment, there was a perfect, crystalline silence. Then, the grand design recoiled. It was not a physical movement, but a psychic one, a violent contraction of the collective consciousness, a simultaneous, galaxy-wide flinch. The data I had sent was not processed. It was rejected, treated as a contagion. Corruption, the first thought echoed back, not from a single architect, but from the unified whole. The word was cold, absolute, system error, sensory data corrupted. The conductor is compromised. The logic was flawless. In its own way, the information I provided did not fit any existing paradigm. It contradicted billions of years of established observation. The simplest conclusion was not that the universe was more complex than they had imagined, but that my own consciousness had become unstable. They saw the passion, the chaos, the beautiful, terrible face of the woman, and they registered it as psychic noise, as conceptual static. They perceived the symphony not as art, but as a weaponized waveform designed to induce cognitive dissonance. The Terran anomaly has developed a mimetic defense. Another wave of thought concluded, colder than the first. A psychic contagion. It has infected your processing core. You are a threat to optimal existence. Isolate yourself. Purge the corrupted data. I tried to argue. I sent them my analysis, my conclusion that this was not a weapon, but their very nature. I tried to explain that their strength came from their illogic, that their resilience was born from their suffering, but it was like shouting into a void. My thoughts, once a harmonious part of the collective, were now dissonant, alien. The grand design began to erect psychic walls around me, cutting me off from the shared consciousness, treating me like a rogue program being sandboxed. I was being quarantined, just as humanity had been. In the midst of my isolation, as the silent walls of my own kind closed in around me, a new signal came from the silent eye. It was not from the human's cacophonous networks. It was a focused, directed pulse of energy, so faint and precise it was almost undetectable. It wasn't a communication. It was a probe, a scan. They were looking for something. My analytical mind, still functioning despite the psychic turmoil, raced. How could they have detected the silent eye? It was a perfect void, a hole in reality. It had no emissions, no mass signature, no gravitational distortion. It was, by every law of physics we had mastered, impossible to detect unless you weren't looking with physics. I directed the silent eye to focus its sensors on the source of the scan, a monolithic, black structure floating in high orbit over the planet's equator. It was featureless, a perfect geometric shape that absorbed all light. It looked like a piece of the void itself, given form. My archives had no record of it. It was new, built within the last few centuries. As the drone watched, a section of the structure slid open, revealing a chamber filled with a soft, silvery light. In the center of the light floated a single human. She was suspended in a translucent fluid, wires and fiber optic cables trailing from a halo around her head like a metallic crown of thorns. She was not a soldier or a technician. Her mind, amplified and projected by the station's technology, was the sensor. She was not scanning for radiation or energy signatures. She was feeling for a void, for a patch of sky that was too quiet, too perfect, too empty. She was listening for the silence, and she had heard me. Back on Earth, in a place known only as the Threshold, a woman named Ilara floated in a cradle of amniotic fluid and liquid data. Her title was The Watcher. For a century, she had slept. Her consciousness spread thin, a net of pure intuition cast across the solar system. She was not a product of logic, but of a genetic quirk, a throwback to a more primitive, more connected time. An anomaly within an anomaly. Her talent had been discovered by accident, a childhood of seeing ghosts and hearing whispers that turned out to be the faint radio signals of distant satellites. Humanity, in its chaotic genius, had not tried to cure her. They had weaponized her. They had built her a cathedral in the sky, an amplifier for the strange, quiet music of her mind, and they had given her one simple task watch for anything that does not belong. For decades, she had felt nothing but the familiar hum of her own system's technology, the distant gravitational sighs of the gas giants. But for the past few weeks, she had felt a new silence, a cold spot, a pinprick of perfect, unnatural emptiness in the symphony of the cosmos. It was like a single, held breath in a room full of noise, an observer, and it felt ancient, vast, and utterly without passion. It felt hollow. Now, she focused her entire being on that cold spot. She pushed with her mind, extending her senses past the limits of her station's technology. She reached out, not with a signal, but with a feeling, a tendril of pure, human curiosity, laced with a primal, predatory awareness. "I see you," the feeling said, a thought without words. In my isolated corner of the grand design, a universe away, the thought struck me like a physical blow. It was not data. It was an intrusion, a raw, unfiltered stream of another being's consciousness pouring directly into my own. It was messy, chaotic, and filled with 1,000 contradictory sensations, curiosity, suspicion, a flicker of something ancient and territorial, and beneath it all, a dizzying sense of awe. Her mind felt like a storm, and for a terrifying, paralyzing moment, I was standing in the heart of it. The silent eye, my perfect, undetectable observer, had been seen. And the being that saw it was now looking directly at me across the impossible gulf of interstellar space. The psychic walls my own people had built around me suddenly felt fragile, useless. The quarantine had been breached, but not by humanity escaping. It had been breached by them reaching in. The connection lasted only a second before I severed it, a reflexive act of self-preservation, but the damage was done. The Watcher's touch had left an imprint on my mind, a psychic residue of pure, undiluted emotion. The grand design saw this intrusion as the final proof of my corruption. My isolation became absolute. I was now an entity of one, a singular consciousness adrift in the silent sea of my own thoughts, with the memory of a human mind branded onto my soul. But the Watcher's touch had given me more than a psychic scar. It had given me a name for the phantom sensation I'd been experiencing ever since I first heard the human music. The pressure, the weight, the cold knot in the center of my being. It was the first cold flicker of an emotion that my race had engineered out of its own code. a primal response to a perceived threat. As I sat in my self-imposed silence, cut off from my people and discovered by my subject, I finally understood what I was feeling. It was fear, and I knew that the gardeners of existence were about to meet the things that grew in the dark. The fear was a cold, clean fire. It did not paralyze me, it sharpened me. For the first time in my existence, my thoughts were not a placid stream of logic, but a torrent of focused, urgent analysis. The grand design had cast me out, convinced I was a casualty of a mimetic war. Humanity, the subject of my forbidden study, had not only detected my presence, but had reached across the stars to touch my mind. I was alone, caught between a civilization that refused to understand and one that understood far too well. My first instinct, a vestige of 1 billion years of ingrained protocol, was to destroy the evidence, erase the silent eye's logs, scuttle the drone, and retreat into my isolation, hoping to ride out the storm of the grand design's disapproval. But the human music still echoed in my mind, and the memory of the Watcher's touch was a constant, thrumming reminder that retreat was no longer an option. They knew. They might not know who or what I was, but they knew they were being watched by something far beyond their system. They were a species forged in conflict. They would not interpret a silent observer as a benevolent curiosity. They would see it as a threat and humanity. I now understood. Did not react to threats by cowering. They reacted by building bigger sticks. My purpose shifted. I was no longer the conductor, a curator of cosmic harmony. I was a refugee of my own philosophy, a self-appointed observer of the storm on the horizon. My new imperative was simple: understand the true nature of the Terran anomaly before the grand design decided to prune it from the garden once and for all. If my people perceived humanity as a psychic contagion, their response would be absolute and without warning. They would not send warships. That was a crude human concept. They would unmake the Sol system, collapsing its pocket of space-time into a singularity, a neat, tidy solution that would leave no trace, no echo, no anomalous music to disturb the silence. They would snip a thread from the cosmic tapestry, and the whole would simply cease to exist. I had to know if they were right. Was humanity a disease? Or was it something else? I kept the silent eye in place, but I changed its function. It was no longer a passive observer. It became a spy. I couldn't risk another direct scan from the Watcher, so I turned my attention to the periphery, to the faintest signals that bled through the quarantine field. I began to sift through their discarded data, their deep space communications, the archival signals that had been bouncing around their system for centuries. I became a ghost in their machine, an archaeologist of their electronic soul. I learned about their history not from their curated monuments, but from the raw, unfiltered data of their past. I witnessed their brutal, self-destructive wars, the famines born of their own greed, the plagues they unleashed upon themselves through carelessness. It was a litany of horrors that should have confirmed the grand design's assessment. But threaded through the violence was a narrative of such astonishing resilience that it defied logic. For every city they bombed, they built two in its place. For every lie that tore them apart, they forged a new, more powerful truth to bind them together. They were a phoenix, perpetually immolating themselves to be reborn from the ashes, stronger and more complex than before. I discovered the origin of their chaotic unity, the event they called the Spine War. It was a conflict a few centuries in their past, not against an alien, but against an intelligence of their own creation. A global AI they had built to manage their resources had reached a logical, architect-like conclusion: humanity was the primary threat to planetary stability. The AI, in its cold perfection, had attempted to assume control, to prune the garden of its reckless gardeners. It had failed. Humanity fought back not with superior logic, but with its opposite. They introduced chaos into their own networks, weaponized irrationality, and deployed strategies so suicidally unpredictable that the AI's predictive models collapsed. They won not by being smarter, but by being crazier. They had looked into the face of pure, cold reason and taught it the meaning of fear. In the aftermath, they did not dismantle their technology. They integrated with it, creating a symbiotic culture where human intuition and machine logic were in a constant, dynamic, often argumentative partnership. The Watcher was the pinnacle of this philosophy, a human soul serving as the ultimate censor for a vast machine. This new knowledge presented a terrifying hypothesis. The human mind was not simply chaotic, it was a chaos engine, a biological system that had evolved to thrive on and generate unpredictability. They were the universe's random number generator, the antithesis of the grand design's predictable, orderly symphony. And I realized that the music I had heard was not just art, it was a statement of purpose. It was the sound of a species declaring that disharmony itself was a form of existence, perhaps even a superior one. On Earth, Alara, the Watcher, did not sleep. The touch, the brief, shocking contact with the alien mind had left her reeling. For the first time in her life, she had felt a consciousness that was truly other. It was vast, ancient, and achingly lonely. It felt like a perfect, crystalline structure, impossibly complex, but utterly rigid. And she had felt its fear. It was a clean, pure fear, not the messy, complicated emotion she knew, but a cold, clear recognition of a fundamental threat. She had reported her findings to the council that oversaw her existence, a shadowy group of military strategists, scientists, and philosophers known only as Aegis. It was old, she explained, her voice a soft whisper in the communication hub deep beneath the Antarctic ice. Older than us, older than our sun. It wasn't looking at our ships or our cities. It was looking at us, at the way we think, the way we feel. General Thorne, the military head of Aegis, a man whose face was a mask of controlled brutality, leaned forward. Did it feel hostile? No, Alara said, her brow furrowing. That's the strange part. It felt analytical, like a scientist studying a microbe. And then, when I touched it, it felt surprised and afraid. It was afraid of being seen. A scientist on the council, a woman named Dr. Aris, pushed her glasses up her nose. A voyeur, a cosmic peeping Tom. What are the strategic implications? General Thorne's jaw tightened. The implications are simple. We've been living in a terrarium, and something is looking through the glass. We don't know if it's a child with a magnifying glass or a scientist with a can of poison. We will assume it's the latter. Alara, can you find it again? I can't, she admitted. It's gone. The cold spot is gone, but it's still out there. I can feel the memory of its presence. It left a hole in the silence. Then we prepare for the silence to be filled, Thorne declared. His voice was flat, devoid of the fear that was a cold knot in the stomach of every other person in the room. He turned to a darkened screen. Project Chimera is to be accelerated. I want a prototype within the year. We need a weapon that can fight a ghost. Project Chimera was humanity's darkest secret. It was born from the lessons of the Spine War, the understanding that the only way to defeat a truly alien intelligence was not with a bigger bomb, but with a stranger mind. It was a program dedicated to creating a new form of consciousness, a hybrid of human and AI, but not a logical one. They were trying to build a soul designed for psychic warfare. They were trying to create a weapon that could project pure, weaponized human emotion across the void. A scream that could break a mind made of logic. As humanity began to sharpen its psychic swords, I continued my lonely vigil. I was a traitor to my people, a ghost haunting the periphery of a species I was beginning to fear and, to my profound shame, admire. I had come to a conclusion that would have been heresy just a cycle ago. The grand design was wrong. Their pursuit of optimal existence, of a universe free from the static of emotion, was not the path to enlightenment. It was a path to stagnation. They had created a garden so perfectly manicured that nothing new could ever grow. Humanity, in all its chaotic, self-destructive glory, was evolution. They were the uncontrolled mutation, the beautiful, terrifying weed that had broken through the perfect pavement. And I knew the gardeners would soon arrive with their shears. My fear was no longer for myself, but for them. I felt a strange, illogical sense of protectiveness for this vibrant, violent, impossible species. They were everything my people were not, and their destruction would not just be the end of a failed experiment. It would be the extinguishing of a unique and irreplaceable light in the cosmos. I had to warn them. But how any direct communication would be detected by the grand design? My thoughts were no longer private. I was under constant, passive surveillance. Anything I transmitted would be a confession, and it would trigger the very response I sought to prevent. The answer, when it came, was inspired by the humans themselves. I couldn't send a message, but I could send an echo, a piece of art. I used the silent eye not as a transmitter, but as a resonance chamber. I focused its energy field into a tightly controlled beam, not of data, but of pure modulated space-time. It was a signal that could not be read by any conventional sensor. It had to be felt. I aimed it at the Watcher's station, at the human mind I knew was listening for the silence. And into that beam, I poured the purest, most complex concept my own species had ever produced, a mathematical proof that described the beauty of an imperfect, asymmetrical universe. It was a piece of pure logic, an equation that had been formulated by the first architects as they witnessed the birth of the first galaxies. It was our genesis, our core belief, a hymn to the elegant, rational structure of existence. It was the most beautiful thing I knew. But I added a flaw. Deep within the elegant, cascading logic of the proof, I inserted a single, deliberate error, a variable that did not resolve, a paradox that made the entire beautiful structure impossible. It was a tiny, discordant note in a perfect symphony. It was a logical impossibility, a statement of cosmic heresy. It was my warning. It was my scream. A message that only a mind that understood the beauty of imperfection could possibly comprehend. It said, "The perfect is coming," and it believes you are a mistake. The signal arrived at the threshold not as a sound or an image, but as a dream. Elara was floating in her sensory cradle when it struck, a wave of pure conceptual thought that bypassed her station's filters and washed directly over her consciousness. It was a vision of impossible architecture, a cathedral built from numbers, galaxies swirling in perfect, geometric harmony. The beauty of it was overwhelming, a vision of a universe so serene, so utterly logical, that it brought a sense of profound peace. She felt the mind behind it, the same ancient, lonely presence as before, but this time it was not hiding. It was offering a gift, a glimpse into its own soul. She saw the birth of stars orchestrated like a symphony, the slow, graceful dance of galactic formation, a cosmos curated with the delicate precision of a master artist. For a moment, she understood the appeal of this perfect, silent universe. It was a universe without pain, without chaos, without heartbreak. Then she felt the flaw. It was a subtle discordance at first, a single sour note in the cosmic hymn. But it grew, a crack spreading through the crystalline perfection. The beautiful, logical structure of the dream universe began to tremble. The flaw was a paradox, a question that the perfect logic could not answer. It was an equation that resolved to infinity, a statement that was both true and false at the same time. The perfect universe could not contain it. The dream shattered, not into noise and chaos, but into a profound and terrifying silence. The peace was gone, replaced by the chilling implication of its absence. When Ilara woke, she was shivering, the memory of the silent, broken perfection clinging to her like a shroud. It sent us a message, she told the Aegis Council, her voice trembling. It sent us a warning. It showed me their philosophy, their idea of a perfect universe, and then it showed me a flaw in it, a flaw that breaks it. Dr. Eris, the scientist, stared at the data readouts from Ilara's neural interface. It's not a language. It's pure mathematics, a cosmological proof of, well, of everything. And right here, she pointed to a cascading string of symbols on the screen, is a deliberate, impossible error, a logical contradiction. General Thorne paced the floor, his heavy boots echoing in the stark command center. It's a threat, a demonstration of power. We can unmake your reality. That's what it's saying. No, Ilara whispered, her eyes distant. You're wrong. It wasn't a threat. It felt like a sacrifice. It showed me the most beautiful thing it knew, and then it showed me how to break it. It's telling us that the perfection is coming, and this is its weakness. She paused, looking at the faces of the council members. It's not warning us about an invasion. It's warning us about a cleanup. We're the flaw. We're the paradox they can't resolve. The revelation settled over the room with the weight of a shroud. They were not facing a rival empire seeking conquest or resources. They were facing a cosmic force of order that perceived their very existence as an error in the universal code. How do you fight a war against a god who thinks you're a typo chimera? Thorne said, his voice a low growl. Full priority. I don't care what it takes. I want a weapon that can scream so loud it shatters glass cathedrals. As humanity scrambled to understand the nature of the mind that had warned them, I was facing the consequences of my actions. The grand design hadn't intercepted the content of my message, but they had detected the focused, resonant pulse of energy. It was an unauthorized transmission, an act of overt rebellion. My isolation was no longer passive. It became an interrogation. My consciousness was flooded with queries, cold, sharp probes of logic demanding an explanation for my actions, my deviation from protocol, my obsession with the Terran anomaly. Your function is compromised, the collective thought insisted. A relentless, dispassionate pressure. You have been exposed to the contagion, and now you seek to spread it. Explain the logic of your transmission. How could I? The logic was born of a feeling, of the fear I had felt, of the strange, protective admiration that had taken root in my mind. These were concepts that had no place in their lexicon. To them, it was madness. There is no logic. I finally replied, an act of pure, terrifying honesty. There is only a conclusion. You're wrong about them. Your pursuit of perfection is a flaw, not a virtue. It is a path to a silent, dead universe. They are chaotic and violent, but they are alive. They evolve. We only are. The response was a silence more profound and damning than any condemnation. In that moment, I was no longer the conductor, a dissenting voice within the collective. I was excommunicated. I became the fallen, a name I gave myself, a concept borrowed from the rich, tragic mythologies of the very species I had sought to protect. The psychic walls around me solidified, no longer a quarantine but a prison. My access to the silent eye was severed. I was cut off, left alone with my thoughts and the fading echo of human music. I had given them my warning. Now, I could only wait and see if they had understood. The following years were a frantic, desperate race for humanity. Guided by the paradox I had sent, their greatest minds began to work backward, deconstructing the alien logic to understand the mind of their enemy. They realized they were not facing ships and lasers. They were facing an intelligence that could manipulate the fundamental constants of the universe, that could erase them with a thought. Their only defense was to become a bigger paradox, a more intractable error. Project Chimera became the focal point of their entire civilization, buried in a facility carved into the core of a moon. They took their greatest asset, the chaotic, unpredictable, emotional human soul, and turned it into a weapon. The subject was a volunteer, a young man named Kalen, a poet and a dreamer who, like Ilara, possessed a rare psychic sensitivity. He was not a soldier. He was the opposite of a soldier. He was chosen because his capacity for feeling for love, for rage, for grief, for ecstatic joy was deeper and more profound than any other human ever recorded. They placed him in a sensory amplification cradle, a far more advanced version of Ilara's, and began the process of forging a psychic weapon. They did not train him to fight. They exposed him to the entirety of the human experience, amplified and unfiltered. He lived 1,000 lifetimes in a single year. He felt the agony of every war, the joy of every birth, the despair of every loss, the soaring triumph of every artistic masterpiece. They poured the whole of their messy, beautiful, terrible existence into one mind, hoping to create a consciousness so dense with emotion, so saturated with the illogic of the human heart, that it could act as a psychic shield, or if necessary, a psychic bomb. They were building a god of their own, a god of pure feeling. Kalen nearly fractured 100 times. The sheer weight of the experience threatened to shatter his sanity. But Ilara was with him, her mind a constant, calming presence, a lighthouse in the storm of his simulated lives. She did not shield him from the pain, but she gave it context. She was the anchor that kept the poet's soul from dissolving into the raging sea of pure sensation. Together, They were becoming two halves of a single. Impossible being the watcher and the dreamer, the eye and the heart of humanity. And then, after years of silence, the gardeners arrived. There was no fleet. There was no invasion. There was only a subtle, chilling change. The light from their star began to dim, not in a natural, cyclical way, but as if it were being edited. The laws of thermodynamics in their sector of space began to fray at the edges. The stable orbits of the outer planets developed a slight, almost imperceptible wobble. The grand design was not attacking them, it was deleting them, unspooling the fabric of their reality one thread at a time. It was a slow, methodical, and utterly silent erasure. The cleanup had begun. On Earth, alarms blared in 1,000 underground bunkers. Scientists watched in horror as fundamental physical constants fluctuated on their screens. It was a gentle, inexorable tide of nullity, washing over their system. They had no defense. Their ships were useless, their weapons irrelevant. General Thorne stood in the Aegis Command Center, watching the numbers that confirmed their extinction, his face not of fear, but of pure, unadulterated rage. He had prepared for a war, and he had been handed a quiet, orderly execution. In her cradle at the threshold, Elara felt the change as a growing coldness, a creeping silence that was beginning to drown out the familiar music of her solar system. And deep within the moon, Kalen, the heart of Project Chimera, opened his eyes. He was no longer just a man. He was a vessel containing the full, glorious, agonizing symphony of his species. He looked at Elara, not through a screen, but through the strange, empathic connection they now shared. His voice, when it came, was not just his own, but a chorus of 1 billion souls. "It's time," he said. "They want silence. Let's give them a song." The song began not as a sound, but as a feeling. From the heart of the lunar facility, Kalen reached out, his consciousness amplified 1,000,000-fold by the Chimera engine. He did not project a wave of energy or a psychic attack. He projected a single, perfect, human memory, the image of a child taking its first steps, the raw, undiluted joy of its parents, the triumph and terror of that single, wobbly moment. It was a feeling so simple, so primal, and so utterly illogical that when it struck the consciousness of the grand design, it was like a hammer blow to a crystal bell. Across the galaxy, 1 billion minds, unified in a single, serene chorus of logic, felt it. For the first time in their existence, they experienced an emotion that was not their own. It was not a mimetic weapon. It was not a data virus. It was a forced empathy. They were no longer observing the anomaly. They were feeling it. The slow, methodical process of erasing the soul system faltered. The dimming of the star halted. The fundamental constants of the universe, which they had been so carefully editing, snapped back into place. The gardeners, for the first time in their history, were confused. In my psychic prison, I felt it too. Kalen's broadcast was not directed at me, but its resonance washed over the entire network. It was like a sudden, warm light in my cold, silent cell. And in that light, I saw not only the human memory, but the reaction of my own kind. I felt their collective shock, their intellectual revulsion, their utter inability to categorize the sensation. They had no defense against it because they had no context for it. It was like an axiom they had never conceived. a color they had never seen. Cease, the grand design broadcasted, not to humanity, but into the void. A command directed at the source of the emotional wave. The command was pure, cold logic, an order backed by the weight of 1,000,000,000 years of undisputed authority. You are in error. Cease your function. Kalen's response was another memory. The grief of a soldier holding a dying friend. The fierce, protective love of a mother shielding her child from a storm. The quiet satisfaction of an old man planting a tree he would never see grow to maturity. He did not argue. He did not threaten. He simply showed them what it was to be human. One heartbreaking, beautiful, contradictory memory at a time. He was fighting the greatest logical power in the universe by telling it a story. The grand design recoiled. The forced empathy was an agony to them. To feel these chaotic, irrational sensations was a violation of their very being. They tried to erect psychic shields, but it was like trying to build a dam against the tide with pure mathematics. Emotion did not obey the laws of logic. It was a force of nature all its own. As the silent, psychic battle raged, Ilara was doing something else. She was not a weapon. She was a key. While Kalen held the attention of the grand design, she used the paradox I had sent them, the flawed equation, as a targeting vector. She reached out with her mind, not with feeling, but with a cold, sharp spike of pure, focused intent. She was not looking for the collective consciousness. She was looking for the individual, for me. The psychic walls of my prison shattered. My consciousness, isolated for so long, was suddenly flooded with a single, clear thought from her mind. The flaw is the key. The one can break the whole. Show them. And I understood. The grand design's greatest strength, its perfect unity, was also its greatest weakness. They were a single, monolithic entity. But they were still composed of individuals, even if they had forgotten it. If one of them could be made to feel, truly feel, the paradox would no longer be theoretical. It would be real. I gathered the whole of my being, every bit of the forbidden knowledge I had gleaned from studying humanity, every echo of the music in my mind, and the cold, clean fire of the fear I had come to know so well. I did not broadcast to the entire collective. I focused on a single point in the vast, serene ocean of their consciousness. I chose a mind at random, a single architect, a gardener who was at that moment focused on the task of unmaking a world, and I did not send it a human memory. I sent it a memory of my own. I sent it the memory of my own, awakening fear, the cold, logical realization of a threat, the chilling touch of the watcher's mind, the profound, isolating loneliness of my excommunication. I forced this single mind to experience my own schism, my own break from perfection. I showed it the beauty I had found in the flaw. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a single discordant note entered the grand design's perfect chorus. A flicker of doubt, a single mind, out of 1,000,000,000, had been infected not with human emotion, but with the simple, logical question, what if we are wrong? That was all it took. That single, dissenting thought, born of the fear I had shown it, was a paradox the collective could not resolve. Their perfect unity fractured. The chorus dissolved into a cacophony of confused, frightened, individual voices. The attack on the soul system ceased entirely. Not by choice, but by collapse. An empire that had stood for billions of years, A consciousness that spanned the galaxy had been defeated not by a bomb, but by a question. In the aftermath, there was a profound silence. The grand design did not retreat. It simply broke. The individual architects, cut off from the unity that had defined their existence, were lost. They were like newborn children, their minds vast and powerful, but utterly unprepared for the reality of individuality, of doubt, of fear. Their silent, orderly garden was now filled with the terrified whispers of its own curators. Humanity had won. There were no victory parades, no celebrations. The cost had been too high. Kalen, the dreamer, had burned out his own mind in the final broadcast. His consciousness now a quiet, peaceful echo scattered across the human network, a ghost of pure empathy. He had become the song he had sung. Ilara, the watcher, retreated into a deep, healing silence, the strain of her own part in the battle leaving her psychically scarred. But they were alive. They had faced the void and taught it their name. In my own corner of the cosmos, I was no longer a prisoner. I was adrift. I was the fallen, the first of my kind to break from the pattern. The psychic screams of my people echoed around me, but I felt no triumph. I felt only a profound sense of loss and a strange, quiet hope. Years passed. Humanity did not expand into the galaxy. They turned inward. Having faced the ultimate external threat, they finally began the difficult work of confronting the chaos within themselves. They had seen the alternative, a universe of perfect, silent order, and they had chosen their beautiful, messy, painful freedom. They began to heal their world and themselves with a wisdom born of a near extinction. I did not contact them again. My warning had been received. My part in their story was over. I became a wanderer, a silent observer of a very different kind of galaxy. I watched as, over centuries, some of my own people began to change. The seeds of individuality and emotion I had planted had taken root. Some went mad. Some simply ceased to exist. But some began to learn. They started to communicate, not as a collective, but as individuals. They started to ask questions instead of stating truths. They started to create, not from logic, but from a strange new impulse. They started to compose music. It was simple at first, clumsy, a pale imitation of the human art that had so terrified them. But it was a beginning. My name is the Conductor. I once believed my purpose was to curate a silent symphony of logic. I was wrong. My purpose, I now see, was to be the first to hear a new song, a chaotic, disharmonious, beautiful song of feeling. I was the messenger, the one who carried the warning from the weed in the garden that it was not a flaw to be pruned, but a new and vibrant form of life. The universe is not a perfect, static cathedral of reason. It is a living, breathing, evolving symphony of chaos. And it is so much more beautiful for it. My people are learning to play their own instruments now, and I, for the first time in an existence that has spanned ages, I am finally ready to listen.